Good morning, guys. This is Jack back here for part 2 on building a bow out of California Bay Laurel using mostly a knife with a few other minimal tools. Ran into some technological difficulties here, and I was basically in the middle of shooting part 2 and my phone stopped working, and I finally figured out a way to use my camera. So basically I did some work on this, and you guys probably won't see that. But basically what I did is I went ahead and I tapered the limbs. And I still have a lot more work to do as far as to get this bow done. It's bending a little bit, but it needs to bend a lot more. Now I did make a mistake here with this bow, and like after I recorded it, I put it in my truck, and a bunch of crazy stuff happened in it, and I ended up leaving it in the back of my truck, and kind of forgot about it, and it was like 80 degrees for the last week. So basically I cooked this thing, and it is covered in checks, and I'll show you guys some close-ups. But I'm not worried about that. Bay is really resilient, and so we're definitely going to get a shooter either way. So anyways, what we're going to be focusing on today for part 2 is tillering the bow. And I'll talk briefly about seasoning your piece of wood and the concepts behind that. But main goal for today is tillering and getting this thing bending, and hopefully maybe getting a string on it. So stick with me. Let's talk a little bit about seasoning wood, best practices. And so as far as seasoning goes, the basic concept behind it is you want to slow down the drying process as much as possible. The smaller the piece of wood, the thinner it is, the less likely it's going to be to crack, and the faster it's going to end up drying. The larger the piece, the more likely it's going to be to crack. For example, if you take a look at some of the firewood you've seasoned, like rounds and even split out chunks, you'll notice there's cracks on the end. So the safest way with bay that I've found is you cut your piece. If it's not a really thin piece, you know, with bay you can cut like really thin shoots and just flatten one side and get a bow out of that, like branches. But if it's a larger log like what I did in the video, or even bigger than that, what you can do is you can go ahead and you can split it out, right? So again, making it smaller so it's less likely to crack. So split it out. If I have the time, I'll even go ahead and I'll rough it out like I did in the first video. And if you haven't seen the first video, check it out. Anyways, so I rough it out like I did in that video, and that's basically my procedure for any time I cut a piece of bay. Now, when I'm not videoing and talking about it, then I do it a lot quicker, normally from cutting it to putting the staves up. Basically, it's like, 10 minutes per stave after I've split them out. I just spend a little bit of time roughing it out, and then I stick it up in the rafters in my house. I live in a place that's really damp. There's no natural sunlight that comes in. I know it sounds bad, and it is. And basically, I jam these up into the rafters and let them dry really slowly. Now, if you want to be really safe, or if you don't have time to split it out, what you can do is you can take your log, and what I do is I'll debark the last like 2 to 4 inches on each end, and then I'll dip that in Elmer's glue, or boiled linseed oils, or varnish, or polyurethane, whatever. You could even rub like bacon grease on there, or tallow, or you can dip it in wax. Anything that's going to slow down the moisture coming out of that piece of wood. But general concepts, the smaller the piece, the more you rough it out, the faster it's going to dry and the less likely it's going to be prone to cracking. But that being said, you can't just like rough this thing out and jam it in your truck and let it bake for 2 days like I did, because it will in fact crack. The biggest problem with checking and cracking is if the crack is running off the side of the limb. If it's just running vertically in the middle of the bow, it may or may not be a problem. It depends on the amount of twist in the bow, and it really depends on a like bow-to-bow basis. Don't freak out. There are solutions, and eventually I will do a troubleshooting video on like problem staves. What do you do if your bow cracks? You know, what do you do if it's really crazy twisted, etc. Anyways, smaller piece, less likely it's going to be to crack. If you want to be really safe, cover this puppy in like fat or something that is going to come off easily with sandpaper, and then jam it in the rafters. The most important thing to cover is the back of the bow. So if you're going to rough it out like this, and say you live in a place that's hot and dry and you're like, Jack, what do I do? You know, there's a lot of natural sunlight. I live in this awesome cabin and it's beautiful, and it's like a really nice place, unlike, me living in a cave. So basically what you do is you can go ahead and take Elmer's glue or any of those materials I just listed and just paint it on the back of the bow, right? So if you paint it on the back of the bow and maybe get the tips a little bit, but other than that, the moisture is mostly going to come out from this side, and it'll come out slowly, and you won't end up getting checks on the back of the bow, depending on where you leave it. Again, if you subject this thing to extreme amount of stress and take it from a place where it has, an insane amount of moisture content and put it in a place with no moisture content in the air, it's going to end up cracking. So just slow the process down as much as possible, and that's all you guys need to think about. Again, like, if anyone tells you like this is how to do it, that's BS, because there is no one way to do things. It really depends on where you live and a set of circumstances that are always going to be changing. Bow building is very dynamic. Working with wood is very dynamic. Wood is constantly changing, and no two trees are the same, depending on the environmental factors that tree is subjected to, whether that's nutrients, sunlight, wind, etc. The grain is always going to be, varied. So basically, it is extremely uncommon for two woods to be exactly the same as far as the grain goes. That being said, there is no one way to season something. The safest way to do it is keep it in a place where it's going to dry as slowly as possible, and if you can, and you're really worried about it, especially if it's a log, dip the ends in wax and or paint varnish on the back of the bow if you've roughed it out and debarked it. That's what all I got to say about seasoning. Really the only way to do it is to learn from it, and I think you guys will find that it's actually not that hard if you do take care of your wood and you do follow the steps that I just, the guidelines that I just laid out there. One more thing, bay specifically is extremely prone to insects. It will become infested with termites the second it gets dry. So if you have termites in your place, you might as well keep it in your car at that point, because they will burrow a million holes into this thing and it'll snap right away. And I can't tell you how many staves this has happened to of mine. Unfortunately, I did not learn that lesson until, I had a huge pile of staves and I moved into a place where there were these little termites, and, sure enough, they didn't go for my Osage staves, thank God. They didn't go for my hickory. They basically only went for the bay, which sucks, but at the same time, I learned a great lesson. So how can you avoid that happening? Well, some of my finished bows never got attacked by termites. I had sealed those with boiled linseed oil and tung oil, a really heavy coating, and my guess is they weren't able to burrow through that. But anyways, just be aware of that. They are prone to bugs and rot. So when you do finish this bow, you do need to seal it immediately, and we'll get to that eventually. But the only reason I included that is it kind of has to do with storage, and while you're seasoning your stave, if you just throw it in a shed where there's a bunch of termites and stuff, like, you're going to come back to this thing and it's going to just be totally thrashed. So anyways, you want to avoid all your hard work going to waste. As far as profiling goes, all you want to do is get the bow looking semi-symmetrical. Now, there are bows that are asymmetrical, and there are certain designs that have certain profiles, but to make just your textbook like bow, then what you'll go ahead and do is just make it relatively symmetrical, right? So basically 3/4 of the bow is going to be the same diameter all the way through, with the last 6 to 8 inches coming down to a narrower tip. Now, don't go too crazy and go too narrow. You're better off, slowly reducing your limbs and not taking off too much. With this bow, I got a little crazy. I was using that really sharp knife, and I ended up taking a lot more off than I wanted to. So once you've profiled, then we're talking about tillering. Tillering is carefully removing material off the belly of the bow to dictate how it bends. The goal with a good tiller is so that when you draw the bow back, it bends evenly on both limbs, right? So it has to have an almost mirroring curve on both limbs, symmetrical if you were to look at it from the side. Now, that doesn't just mean like measuring it out, so like, okay, I'm doing 3/4 of an inch, I'm just gonna put this on the belt sander and like rip it through. Some people do that. I've seen students do that weren't patient, and it totally does not work unless you have a perfectly flat stave, like a board bow, for example. But the wider the limb, as far as this goes, the wider the back of the bow, the thinner it's going to be as far as the tiller. The narrower, the thicker. So just think about that, right? So as you tiller, it's a really slow process of removing wood and checking it constantly. So what we'll go ahead and do now is we're going to continue removing wood, with our goal being to get an even bend throughout the entire bow. So I'm going to have this bow bend through the handle, although it will mostly be bending, you know, say from here out and here out. It does have quite a bit of twist in it, and that's unfortunate, but we're going to make it work. So let's get to tillering. I'm going to grab my Shinto file, which is a Japanese saw file. I believe you guys saw me using it, maybe not yet. Basically, it's made from hacksaw blades. It's got a coarse side and a fine side, and it removes an enormous amount of wood. If it's your first time building one of these things, as soon as it starts to bend, then I would lay off with the Shinto and I would start using something finer. I think you'd be really surprised at how quick this thing goes from being like too heavy to too light. There's a very fine line, and by heavy and light, I mean the weight of the bow at the intended draw length. Now, something like this is not going to have like my full 28-inch draw length. It's going to be more of a snap shooter. I could end up building it like that, but the chances of it snapping are pretty high for how short the bow is. So I'll probably end up having like maybe a 22-inch or something like that draw length. Anyways, that's kind of irrelevant at this point. I'm gonna get to tillering, and let's get this thing done. I'm constantly looking at the diameter. So I'm looking, okay, is this side of the limb thinner than this side? Oftentimes you do want them to be even to the eye on both sides. So that's just something to consider while you're working on your bow and tillering. Don't go crazy and just work on one spot forever. Ideally, like I'll do a few strokes like this, and then I'll take a look at it and I'll see how it's looking, and then I'll do a few more. Better safe than sorry, especially when you've already put this much work into something and potentially let it dry for weeks. Right now, bending mostly in the handle, and I need it to bend out here a little more. Let's check this side. This side's a little funkier, but it's still very thick out on the narrower parts of the bow. Can you guys see how it's straight right in here and it's mostly bending up here? This side's bending a little more. So what we need to do right now is we need to work on this and getting this to bend. Bending a little bit more, getting really close to being able to put a string on this.